Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Volt, and first things first, let's get into the builds. And oh boy, are there a lot of builds with Volt. So this first build is just a cookie cutter thermal Sunder build made for nuking low levels, for relics, and just base star chart clearing for whatever reasons, such as relic farming. There's really not too much to go over this build, as there's really not much to it. Preparation for filling your energy on spawn, so that way you don't have to waste energy pads, and everything else is just built for range, and you don't really need too much strength to kill the enemies. You can get more strength once you put on Archon Shards, which I'll talk more about later, because you'll be able to take off Prime Continuity and throw on something like Augur Secrets, and you can also freely run Transient Fortitude instead of Umbral Intensify here. I'm just having polarity problems. The second build is just a standard utility build. However, in hindsight, Silence wasn't the best option, as high range isn't that great with Silence, and instead Ensnare would be better. This build was for Disruption level cap, and it is a bit outdated, but it definitely still works. Capacitance keeps you and your team alive. Molt-efficiency as strength is mostly irrelevant. However, if you do care about your 2 buff, you are free to run Molt Augmented instead. And Ensnare or Silence are both there just to keep up your survivability. Silence is probably a bit better for that, but Ensnare works better with the stats that this build has. The third build is just for boss killing. This is the Eidolon variant. This build in particular is definitely not min-maxed, but I cannot min-max it, as if I change the polarities to make this build a bit better, it will ruin the other builds, and I do not have a second Volt Prime. That being said, for the weapons and loadouts I use for all bosses, these stats cut it, and I still make all of the breakpoints to one-shot limbs and stuff like that. This build can easily be converted to a Profit Taker build by just simply changing Shock Trooper out for Total Eclipse. Shock Trooper pretty much instantly kills every single build meant for Profit Taker, and will extend the fight out significantly. As for the final 2 builds, these are both armor strip builds meant for survival. Terrify and Pillage both do 2 separate things, and I will explain their ups and downsides as best as I can. So with Terrify, as always, Terrify CCs enemies, which can negatively impact your KPM, and spoiler alert, it does. And the other problem is, normally to minimize the effect that Terrify has on your KPM in a negative manner, you opt to run Creeping Terrify. That way the enemies are also slowed when they're running away. That way they don't really get to run too far. The problem is, as Volt, you really do not have the mod space to slot Creeping Terrify. The only way you can do it is by dropping Prime Continuity, which drastically lowers your damage output, especially when you don't have strength either, or by dropping Capacitance. The problem with dropping Capacitance is this is how you stay alive in conjunction with shield gating. Capacitance greatly increases your survivability. It cannot be underestimated. Also, Terrify does have a slightly longer cast time than Pillage, which is also a little bit annoying. As for the Pillage build, its upside is, first off, it double shield gates you on cast. So whenever you cast it, you get a shield gate, and whenever it retracts, it shield gates you, and it also cleanses status effects such as magnetic procs and heat procs. Again, you can keep Capacitance, and you also have really high strength. However, you have less duration, which is a bit of a downside. That being said, Pillage is significantly more KPM than Terrify, and the cast time on Pillage isn't as long as Terrify either, so it feels a bit more fluid to play. The biggest downside to the Pillage build is that it is very hard to sustain, as we have significantly worse sustain, as we are forced to run Blind Rage to meet the strength threshold to full strip with Pillage in one cast. With Corrosive Projection, Molt Augmented, and Moderai, we have 343% strength, and we only need 328% strength to full strip. This build can be made better, as whenever we cast Pillage with this build, We do not actually reset our shield gate fully. We need one more Augur mod on the main build to do so. What you can do is, once you have Archon Shards, you can replace Umbral Intensify with Augur Secrets instead. And now not only do you reset your shield gate fully on cast of Pillage, well, that's all it does, but you need a single red strength shard, and it does not have to be Tauforged, and now you full strip in one cast with Pillage again. Speaking of Archon Shards, they do a lot for Volt, as what I would ideally run is one Tauforged red shard for duration, one regular shard for duration, a regular shard for strength, a casting speed shard, and an energy shard. With these shards, Volt is significantly better, and he is one of the best candidates for shards, as they impact all of his builds in a very, very meaningful way. Now, I said that these were all for the builds, however, there is one more concept, and also, Volt can run a million different builds, like almost every single helminth that is decent, Volt can run and make use of and work, because Volt is very flexible. But one more main build is a build similar to this, but instead of built for killing bosses, you can just build it in a normal gun frame way. And with Volt, it works very well. So you could use something like Eclipse, Roar, or Nourish. And particularly with Nourish, it is very good, as you can run Shock Trooper to give your weapons innate electricity. That way you only need Toxin, and now your guns have innate corrosive. Then with Nourish, now your guns are doing corrosive and viral damage. And then once you add on the electric shield, which adds a second damage, which always deals electricity damage, now you're dealing electricity, you're doing raw electricity, you're dealing corrosive and viral. And that is really good, because not only is that just a lot of damage, but that's also a lot of elements that you're adding on for your condition overload and your galvanize mods. That is it for the main builds, and now for the rest of the loadout. The primary weapon is, of course, your AoE weapon of choice. With Volt, you can get away with using single target weapons, especially if you use something like Ensnare. I personally really like the Tonk Core as Volt, because with the Tonk Core, you already run Prime Fast Hands or something like max ammo capacity in this flex slot. But since Volt already has an innate reload speed buff in his kit, you can drop this utility mod and slot something like Prime Firestorm for a larger AoE, or just even more damage with just another mod that just got cleared up on your build. Secondary is your secondary of choice. Of course, if you need something to pop nullifier bubbles, the new core is always great, and melee is also always your choice. I suggest the Glaive or something like the Praetos just for the passive parkour velocity and sprint speed. With Volt, you pretty much always want to use Moderai for the 50% casting speed, really want that casting speed, and the 40% ability strength. And last but not least, the Companion, which is of course a Panzer with the synth mods equipped. Now, moving on to the rankings, we'll be discussing Volt in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, his KPM, secondly, his survivability, thirdly, his viability, and finally, how fun he is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mott run, with no Spectres, no on-call, and of course, no Archon Shards. Now moving on to the first topic, his KPM. And just right off rip, Volt's KPM is actually really nice, because you are armor stripping the enemies permanently using Pillage or Terrify if you choose that, but I will be using Pillage for all the baselines here, as that was the build that performed overall the best for me. So, since you're already armor stripping the enemies, that means that you can't really have too bad of a KPM. But you also have a weapon damage buff via shooting through your shield, which gives you 50% electric damage when shooting through it at all times, which doesn't override any single elements that you have, such as if you're using Viral Heat, you will still have Viral Heat, but now you will have Viral Heat electricity. On top of this, it gives you a 50% crit damage buff, meaning that with armor stripped enemies and 50% electricity damage and 50% critical damage, you will scale with your weapons for a very long time. Not only this, but his second ability frees up mod slots on some weapons, allowing them to, well, they get an extra mod slot. So you can put another utility mod on there, which obviously increases your KPM, or you can just put more raw damage on the weapon, which gives it better scaling. So he already has really high scaling rate off rip, and now we haven't even talked about his fourth ability, which just nukes all of the trash fodder like crewmen and lancers and butchers. So once they're armor stripped, they also just get nuked, so that also increases your KPM. With Pillage, I was getting a pretty consistent above 100 KPM, and with Terrify, I was getting roughly 90. I think my highest KPM with Pillage was around 110, and I was consistently getting about 105. So because of Volt's very high scaling and the versatility that he allows for different weapons and different modding choices with the weapons, and the fact that he easily armor strips and has a supplemental nuke, I will give Volt an S- for his KPM rank. Now moving on to the second topic, his survivability. And again, his survivability is very, very good as long as you're using capacitance. Remember, I told you not to underestimate it. So as long as you're keeping your 4 up at all times, you are unkillable. You virtually cannot die as long as your 4 is up. On top of this, if you're using Pillage, you also have a second thing that is keeping your shields up in one cast. Like you cast Pillage once and it resets your shield gate twice on cast and then 2 seconds later. This means that if you cast Pillage and then your 4 runs out, a second or 2 later your shield gate will get reset no matter what, and by then you should be ready to cast your 4 again. The only real way that you ever die as Volt is if you ever let your Moderai buff run out and you go to cast your 4, and the millisecond that you cast your 4 and you reset your shield gate, while you're still in animation, enemies instantly break your shield gate and kill you before you're out of animation. However, as long as you keep your Moderai buff up, or if you just have an Archon Shard slotted for casting speed, this never happens. So if you do die to that, it is entirely your fault. The only other real way to die is just simply not paying attention or just dying to violence or getting nullified. But again, those are also just your fault. Because of these reasons, and the fact that with capacitance you're just completely invincible unless you make a major mistake, I'm going to give Volt an S rank for survivability. All of that being said, I didn't even mention or bring up the fact that you also have a shield in front of you at all times, which blocks all projectiles from in front of you, and your 4 also CCs the enemies. Like, just to reiterate, Volt is extremely, extremely hard to kill. Now moving on to the third topic, Volt's overall viability, and I think this is where Volt excels, and that should already tell you the ranking, as I gave his KPM an S- and his survivability an S. So Volt's overall viability is insanely high. Volt, in my opinion, is the best all-arounder Warframe in the entire game, and I will do my best to explain why. First off, let's just go through all of the different game modes. So Volt excels everywhere, and even where he doesn't excel, he's still above average. Firstly, Disruption. So Disruption is probably one of Volt's weaker areas, but he's still very good there. Why? Is because, well, having a movement speed buff is always really nice in Disruption, as it allows you to find the Demolist quicker and get to the Demolist quicker. On top of that, Volt has an ability that just CCs all the enemies, which is also really nice for Disruption, as it allows you to isolate the Demolist and keep the enemies off of you while you're dealing with the Demolist. On top of all of that, he also has weapon damage buffs in the form of his 2 and his 3, which help you to kill the Demolist. Exterminates, obviously Volt is very good at Exterminates. Rescues and Captures, again, he's obviously very good there. He has speed buffs and he can easily nuke the maps. Survival, he is above average there due to his very high survivability and above average KPM. Interceptions, well, they're interceptions, he's okay there. Having CC tools to get enemies off of the consoles while they're hacking them is also very nice. And then there's excavations and mobile defenses. Excavations and mobile defenses are the two game modes that are the hardest to be good at. The reason for this is the only way to be good at these game modes is if you have a way to protect the point. Volt doesn't have a great way to protect the point, but the fact that he has a way to protect the point at all already makes him better than like 90% of the other Warframes. So again, the electric shield isn't great at protecting them, but it is better than nothing. And again, he also has CC in his kit to help protect the points as well. Then there are defense missions, and I think that this is probably Volt's worst game mode because he doesn't really... His 4 alone can't really nuke the enemies unless they're armor stripped, and that's not really always a good option to have in defense missions. So unless they're low level, he can struggle in defense missions. And since he's good in pretty much every single game mode, that of course also makes him good for Liches and Sisters. I don't think that he's the best for Liches and Sisters, due to him not being that great in defense missions, and due to their relevance in there, especially during Liches. I do think that there are some better frames for Liches and Sisters, but again, he's one of the better ones. So since he just excels in all of these different game modes, and he's very good for relics, especially group relics with randoms due to him helping the team get from point A to point B quicker, I think that Volt deserves the first and probably only S+ rank for Viability. Now moving on to the final topic, Volt's fun, and I think that Volt is also very fun. The reason for this is just because of how flexible he is to build and all of the different build choices you have for him. Oh, you want to play a gun frame? Sure, just play a Shock Trooper Volt build using Nourish, Eclipse, or Roar. Or hell, you just want more CC? Play a gun build with Breach Surge, or a Nuke 4 build with Breach Surge just for like extra CC. You want a grouping tool? Sure, throw on Ensnare or Pool or Geyer's ability, why not? Like, anything that you want to do, you can make it work on Volt. So, even if you don't like super heavy caster frames, you can still play Volt and just get rid of his 4 and play him as a gun frame. If you like caster frames, you can just keep his 4 and use him as a nuker. So, Volt, there is a playstyle for pretty much anyone, and it's hard to not find one that you yourself enjoy. So I will give Volt an A+ for his fun rank. In conclusion, Volt is an S tier Warframe who is a jack of all trades yet also a master of most as well. With his large pool of builds, there is surely a way to play him which everyone will enjoy.